question number 2 is essentially the opposite of question number 1 because they're giving you the exponential version of things and they're asking you to write that as a log. Again, it's the rewrite part that's most important right now to me. So if you don't end up spending a lot of time focusing on x, that's okay. But it's worth noting that solving for x might actually be the first thing you'll want to do in these problems because these problems are already in exponential form and that's probably the language that your brain is most familiar with by default. So it may be easy to look at some of these and just get what x is before complicating things with the log. For example, 3 to the power of something is 3. Well, I know that power must be 1. So that might be an easy thing to do right off the bat before mixing the logs into it. If you're ready to do the log part though, this is, in my opinion, a little bit harder to do. I find it harder to translate from exponential to log than the other way around because the order of a log gets so jumbled up. What I personally like to do, especially as I'm first getting used to logs, is to write the word log and to kind of mentally sketch out, even by literally drawing it, that little arrow thing so that I can build the log expression in the order that my brain normally thinks about it. For example, I normally think about this exponential thing in this order, 3 to the power of x equals 3. So I like to write my log expressions in the order I would say them exponentially. The 3 is the base, so I always build that part in first. Notice, of course, first I did write the word log. So technically, I guess you would say this the little subscript is the second part that I did. But arguably speaking, you can do that all in one step. We know for sure it's going to be log base 3 because the base of the exponent is always the base of the log. We call them both the word base for that reason, because they share the same role. Base of the exponent, base of the log. Base and subscript, same thing. So I know it's going to be 3 to the power of x. And I know when I'm doing this little loopy structure with a log, the power is always the number on the opposite side of the log. So notice I have immediately written where that power is going to go as equals x, and I left a big empty space in the middle. That's because the empty space always represents the last part of my exponential expression. I always say 3 to the power of x, which means I swing all the way over to the opposite side of the expression, and then I come back to this middle bit, the bit that's attached to the log base 3, and that is the last part that I write. That's always the part that I think of last. That's the part in the exponential that I would say last. So even when I'm writing it in log form, I would write that part last as well. And then I can recite it back to myself. 3 to the power of x equals 3. So I can see that everything is in the right order. If it helps you to do a kind of unorthodox writing like this, that's totally fine. When you look at your answer at the end, nobody's ever going to be able to tell which part you wrote first, which part you wrote second, which part you wrote third. So write it in whatever order you want to. And if it's a little messy, that's okay. The only things we really pay attention to are the subscript, to make sure that it's smaller and a little bit lower than the rest of the numbers and letters in the expression, and the general placement of the equal sign, to make sure that the power is on the opposite side of the equal sign from the other numbers in your log expression. Those are the only two things we really care about. So if it's a little messy, or if it's a little weird because you have awkward spacing, nobody cares. Just do it in a way that makes sense to you. In letter B, again, practice rewriting that log thing if you want to just kind of get to the essential skills. If you want to do the exponential part too, that's great. You can actually do the exponential part right here. You have something to the power of -5 equals 243. The negative power definitely tips us off that we're going to be flipping something. So if you think about this, you could theoretically flip the x. It becomes 1 over x to the power of 5. And we end up with 243 as an answer. That's a little bit challenging to think about. And you'll notice before I had erased it, I had kind of instinctively written it another way, and you might find that the other way I wrote it was actually a little more helpful. I flipped 1 over x and raised it all to the power of 5, which is another way that you can do negative exponents. That's actually totally fine, because I thought about this and thought, oh, well, if I'm going to turn 1 over something into a whole number, that something must be a fraction. And again, this is kind of hard to do, but inevitably you'll have to think to yourself, something flipped over and became a whole number at the end, so it must have meant I was starting with a fraction. And that tips me off that I'm thinking about some fraction to the power of 5 that would give me 243. It ends up being 1/3. If you want to just guess and check in a calculator, or if you want to do anything to help you kind of figure that out, it's fine. But if you check, 1/3 to the power of -5 is 243. And I'm fine with you using a calculator for that, because right now it's not the main focus of our time here. Our time here should be best spent working with logs. Let's practice the log part. I'm going to write the letters log, and then I'll just kind of lightly sketch in that arrow to give me a good idea of the order of things. It's always going to be log base whatever the exponential base was. So log base x. The power always goes on the opposite side of the equals sign. So the power was -5. I'll write that on the opposite side over there. And then in the center, attached to the log base x, is the last number there, 2, 4, 3. I'll recite it back to myself. X to the power of -5 equals 243. Yep, the log pattern makes sense, so I know I've got everything in the right order. It definitely takes some getting used to. It's not the easiest, smoothest translation at first for some people, and that's totally okay. This all takes time, and some people really do struggle at first with writing logs. It's totally okay to just kind of get a system that works for you gradually and not feel like you have to understand this in the first 5 seconds. In letter C, again, I'll forego the exponent part because that's not the most important part right now. If you're curious, x is 3 because 1/2 times 1/2 times 1/2 is 1/8. But again, not the most important part right now. Let's just focus on the log. We're going to write the word log. I'll lightly sketch in my little arrow as kind of a guideline. It's almost like having a little sketch that you can then darken in. If you've ever learned to draw, sometimes they say that. Sketch a basic idea and then darken in the details. It's kind of the same thing with log. We're sketching in the arrow and then we'll darken in the details of the numbers as we go. So log base is always the exponential base. The base is 1/2 to the power of x. So I know that x must be on the opposite side of the problem, other side of the equal sign, equals back around 1/8. Usually it's customary to put fractions like the 1/8 in parentheses to show that the log applies to both the top and the bottom numbers. If you don't put parentheses, it's not a deal breaker. It's just one of those little things that, again, you'll get used to as a mathematician. So you can read it back to yourself. 1/2 to the power of x equals 1/8. We know we're good to go. One more just to make sure. This one exponentially is a little bit easier. 15 to the power of 0 is 1, so at least that one was a slightly easier x to solve if you're still solving for x. But let's focus on the log, the most important part. Log, and then I'll draw my little arrow. The exponential base is the log base, so log base 15. Other side of the equal sign is the power, so 15 to the power of 0 means 0's on the opposite side. And then back around to attach to the log must be the last bit, which is the x. I'll say it back to myself. 15 to the power of 0 equals x. Nailed it. So again, once you've got a system that works for you, even if it's slightly different than the system that I use myself, that's completely fine. As long as it works for you, all good. So take some time, do question number 2, check the answer key, make sure that you have a pretty solid idea of how to go back and forth from exponential to log, and from log to exponential, so that when we move on to question number 3, which is a little bit different, you'll have a chance to really say to yourself, okay, I'm starting to understand this, now I can build up a little bit more.